So at the end of this year, we are going to have a new generation of video game consoles. So we're going to start asking that question: when is it time to move on from the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One? When will it be time to just move on from those platforms? And I have to say, I hope it's sooner rather than later, because already we're seeing a situation where these old consoles are holding back gaming. I mean, it's been this way the entire generation, really, because when those consoles came out, they were so underwhelming. And then towards the middle of the generation, we got the PlayStation 4 Pro and the Xbox One X, which also weren't really that impressive. I mean, games still weren't running above 30 frames per second. The games were a lot of these games struggle to run properly on consoles, and I think honestly with this new generation of consoles, I think this should happen a lot sooner than in previous generations, just moving on to the next generation of consoles and developers no longer supporting the old ones. I know, especially for people who bought the Xbox One X and the PS4 Pro, people are not going to like that because people may have just bought a new console 1 year ago, 2 years ago, and of course, the console manufacturers and video game developers are not going to realistically just abandon those platforms immediately when they are going to have the larger install base for a couple of years to come, right? As soon as a new generation of consoles come out, that's what always happens, is that it takes a little while for people to move on to the next console, right? I mean, I remember when during the 7th generation, the beginning of the 7th generation, the PS2 was still selling millions of units every year. I mean, you were still getting new PS2 games until like 2013, 2014. I think that was the last PS2 game that was developed. I think it was Pro Evolution Soccer 2014. I believe that was the last game. But I would say, like, up until 2009, you were still getting major AAA releases. You had a new Jak and Daxter game. You had Devil Summoner 2 from Atlas, which was a phenomenal JRPG that came out in 2009 that people don't really talk about, but it was an amazing game, and it was only released on the PS2 years after the new generation of consoles came out. So that just speaks to the longevity of that console, but you're really not seeing that anymore these days. I mean, with the last generation, the PS3 stopped getting support around 2015 because people were buying the new consoles. And I think, in this case, you're going to have a lot more demand for the new consoles than you had previously. Because, yeah, sure, this generation's going to be a lot shorter than the last one, in the sense that the new consoles came out in 2013, and the next generation is going to come out in 2020, so that's the 8th generation is going to be 7 years long, and the last generation was almost it was 8 years long, so you had a little bit more time, but the underwhelming performance of these consoles, I think people are starting to demand a lot more graphical fidelity, a lot better performance for their games. Console gamers, I think, are going to really be a lot quicker to jump to the new generation of consoles, is what I think is going to happen. So I would expect realistically around 2022 is when we're going to when the PS4 is going to be completely discontinued and the Xbox One. But I really don't want to see a repeat of the last generation where the new generation of consoles comes out, right? And developers are still prioritizing the old hardware, like what happened with the PS3 and the PS4, where you had the PS4 come out, even though it was selling like crack for the first year. You still had 2014 was still like a really dry year for the new generation of consoles. You didn't have too many noteworthy games that came out during that year, and the very few that did, they were good, but you still had developers like Gearbox, for example, developing the new Borderlands games exclusively for the last generation of consoles and prioritizing old hardware. And the thing is, with these old consoles barely chugging along, I mean, Doom Eternal, for example, is barely passable on the PS4. Like, id Software had to cut a lot of corners to get that game to run the PS4. It's pushing that console to its very limit. And of course, going back to Cyberpunk, I'm very concerned that CD Projekt Red has been cutting corners to get that game running on the PS4 and Xbox One with that old hardware. Getting games to run on that can really hold back that game for everybody, whether you have the most powerful gaming rig or if you buy the new generation of consoles. That game could be a lot better if they just focused completely on newer hardware than the older hardware. Just imagine if CD Projekt Red had decided to make a PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 version of The Witcher 3. How differently that game would have turned out. Yeah, most likely wouldn't have been nearly as good, because dedicating those resources and making the game playable on older hardware, you have to cut a lot of corners and remove a lot of features for that game to really be viable on older platforms. So I'm kind of nervous about Cyberpunk because of this news, honestly. And I hope I'm wrong, but I feel like this is going to severely diminish the quality of the game. The fact that they decided to focus on the older hardware and not the newer hardware. I think they should have honestly made this a next-gen exclusive. One of the big games in the next generation that gets people into it. And yeah, sure, maybe in the short term you wouldn't have sold as many copies, but ultimately the quality of the game would have been so much better if they decided to cut the PS4 and Xbox One versions altogether. I think, honestly, I just hope they cancel it, but they're definitely not going to do that at this point. I think they're too far in to just cancel the PS4 and Xbox One version, but that's something that I honestly hope that happens, but it most likely won't, unfortunately. Anyway, let me know what you guys think about developers supporting older hardware, such as the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, and what you think about, like, what does that mean for the overall quality of video games for the next 2 years or so, however long that these consoles will continue to be supported. Because, I mean, the thing about consoles is that, unlike wine, it does not age well. So sooner than later, we need to move on from this old hardware, because it's really holding a lot of these games back from their full potential.